counselor, if you are out there and you want to volunteer your time and your expertise, that please give me a call so we can connect you to families that need this valuable. I'm glad we're going off on that real positive note that we need help, people. So once again, we want to thank you, the community, those that called in, those that called in with the story. We want to thank St. Petersburg for stepping up to the plate. We want the mayor to look at the candidates. Friendship is not about friendship when it comes to everybody's lives. We need a well-rounded chief of police. And so we're going to ask that she do her due diligence and get a chief of police that is going to be for all the people and have a handle on what's going on today. We out of time here. Trinity and Faith, I hope you're ready to say a good book. We got it's real good from last week, this week. So we're going to be in service tomorrow. Y'all wear white. It is Missionary Sunday. Until next Saturday, God bless you all. That's what really happens. See y'all next Saturday, 9 a.m.
Serving Tampa Bay since 1954, the Heritage Station, WTMP, Egypt Lake, Tampa, Clearwater, 97.5 in Pinellas.
The views, opinions, and conclusions on this radio broadcast are solely the views of this particular program and its host. The views and opinions expressed on this broadcast does not reflect or represent the views of WTMP, its officers, staff, or advisors.
Good morning, and welcome to the Call for Help show. I'm your host, Attorney Paul Rebein. With me here in the studio in WTMP are my co-hosts Robin Lockett and Pastor Brenda Fruster. How are you guys doing today?
Good morning. Doing well, thank you.
Good. We're live on Facebook and live on WTMP. Give us a call. We'd love to hear from you, 813-251-9867. We're honored today to have as our guest Brent Robinson. Brent, as a way of introduction, is a high school history teacher in Dunedin High School. Has been teaching for a long time. Teaches, I would call it regular history class, but also African American history class. He's going to talk to us today about some things that have been happening in the school. Particularly, he was teaching a book called Creating Black Americans that was challenged by one of the parents as being part of the 1619 project, which you may or may not know what that is, but it is not allowed to be taught in the state of Florida, and the teacher challenged the book as being part of that. So Brent took a stand, fought for the book, and he's going to tell us how that came out and also kind of what's backlash has happened since that time. Brent, welcome to the Call for Help show.
Hey, thank you all so much for being here. I'm
Welcome,
so grateful.
Brent.
I'm so humbled. I just want to say hi to Brenda. Hey, Brenda. How you doing?
Brent, just tell us a little bit about your background and then about this book, about the class and the book that you were teaching.
Well, I'm one of those few Florida natives, and most of my family's from Lake County in Central Florida. I earned my master's degree in 1997 in African American history, and I have the privilege of teaching African American history, also world history. And this is my 25th year of teaching, all but one at Dunedin High School. And so, I can give you a brief overview of everything that happened if you need me to do that.
Yeah, just talk about the class. It was the African American history class. Is that an elective?
It's a one semester elective. Anybody from grades 9 through 12 can take it. But essentially what happened was back in June, I was aware of what was happening around the country with angry school board meetings denouncing the false issue of critical race theory. So I spoke to my school board just to educate them about what critical race theory was, what it's not, its history, and that it's not being taught anywhere in Pinellas County or any classroom in the United States. Long story short, the very next month, a woman showed up. She made her claims about critical race theory, but she also called me out by name. But it's important that your listeners understand that when my first semester started last year, on the third day of the year, I had a young man in my class. He dropped the class. That's very common for students to drop and add electives. I didn't really get a chance to know him. But about 2 weeks later, an appeal was filed by a parent challenging my textbook, as you said, Paul. And then I learned that the woman who challenged the book was the same woman who spoke at the school board in July, but that her son was also the young man who had dropped my class. So it seems pretty clear that she had him enroll in the class just so she could get the materials in the textbook. So long story short, I would always support a parent's right to challenge a book if they felt so fit. But a committee was formed, and she lost her textbook appeal, but she took it to the next level. She filed what's called a formal records request. I had to submit all of the handouts, video links, all the materials I use in my African-American history class. And to this date, she's lost that appeal. I've already started my new second semester. So that's where it stands. I mentioned to you all as well, I just got an email last Saturday from Moms for Liberty demanding that I resign my position immediately. And we most recently spoke at the school board on Tuesday night. I was joined by many brilliant, beautiful, fierce African-American women who are part of the Clearwater Urban Leadership Coalition with me on Tuesday night. And we basically stood up to the school board and said one thing: we demand that American history be taught in its entirety. And so that's kind of where we stand right now.
Why do you think people don't want you to teach this book or whatever, whatever's in the book?
I think that what happened in the summer of 2020 across the country, and moment of silence if there wasn't a 9-minute video that recorded the death of a fellow human being named George Floyd, because we've seen the death of Black men at the hands of police year in and year out, but there was something different about that. And long story short, I think that the pandemic ripped the scab off, and a lot of white Americans were seeing how deeply flawed many of our institutions were. So what would have otherwise been the sad death of a young Black man was seen in the context of systems breaking down at the same time. So people were starting to question about, the institutions of our country as a whole. And as a result, many more white Americans were wanting to examine more deeply the real history, because they were starting to understand that this is a systemic problem. But of course, that's deeply troubling to many other Americans. And so that's when you started to see, President Trump address the nation on July 4th at Mount Rushmore. He made the claim that we teachers are teaching students to hate America, that we're trying to indoctrinate students. So this backlash has been nicely packaged around this mantra, this false issue of critical race theory. And of course, now where we stand is that critical race theory is being used to label anything and everything related to just teaching about America's history of racial injustice.
Yep. Just to give a few comments from our people on Facebook, Dee said, I applaud you for taking such a stance, especially as a younger white male.
52.
Hey,
Thank you for that.
I told you had great cheekbones.
No,
I think just
it would be easy to keep quiet and focus on keeping your job and not make waves. But you can't let a small group of people who may not even know much about the subject or the book they're challenging to control, what happens in the school. And I do think we all need to learn our true history, not the history as we'd like it to be, or the story that we were all told if it doesn't happen to be true. And so I appreciate you, Brent. I'm sure your students love you, and keep fighting.
Absolutely.
Give us a call, 813-251-9867, if you want to ask Brent a question or talk about this topic. And now, of course, we've got the Stop Woke Act, which is going to codify some of these things and give parents a private right of action to sue the school district. I don't know if you could sue a teacher like yourself. I hope not, but for teaching critical race theory, or sue an employer for requiring them to sit through some kind of training or educational session about critical race theory. So definitely this is a very hot topic. And the Woke Act, the Stop Woke Act, is is designed to keep students from being made to feel uncomfortable. Did you think anything that you were teaching made anyone uncomfortable, or how did the students react to it?
And I certainly want to hear from Robin and Brenda as well. And I know, Robin, you're about to share your insights and your experiences. But, obviously, I mean, I can't think of a single time in 25 years of teaching where I've ever even thought that I was making a student feel uncomfortable. There's a great deal of fear out there among a lot of my colleagues because we're just teaching history. I've never once met a teacher that tried in any way, shape, or form to tell a student how to think. And on the first day of the year, I always tell my students, I love you if you're a Democrat. I love you if you're a Republican. I love you if you're an independent. It's not my job to tell you what to think. It's my job to help you be a better thinker. So, what I can say is that, should a student feel anguish, these 3 words have been used in 7 states now. These 3 words have been replicated. Students shouldn't be made to feel discomfort, anguish, or guilt. Now, I think that's done on purpose to deflect from what's really happening. Is that what might happen among young people is that they feel uncomfortable knowing that this has happened in their nation and they're seeing connections between the past and the present. The degree to which someone might feel guilt because of their, quote, race is simply a tactic used to try and deflect from actually examining our nation's history in its entirety.
Yep. Robin, I think I interrupted you. What do you think about this?
I think that you're right. It is a deflector. I think that George Floyd, had there not been a video, because we've been saying it all along, but it allowed others to see it in real time, right? That when he died, all it takes is a few. All it takes is a few people to cause a commotion and to continue, and somebody to pick it up and for them to continue it. What I'm not seeing is, just like during the march, it's something we've been saying, yelling about racism and the injustice. And once America was able to see it, then they, I would tell them, it's not us, it's not the Black Americans that has to say something, because we've been saying it all along. We need for you to say it. So even with this critical race theory, if you don't agree with it, if you're white, if you any other race, we need other people to step up and say that they don't agree with it also. It shouldn't be just Blacks saying, hey, we are fighting for you to tell the whole truth. But we need, again, other people to stand up and say the same thing.
That's right. And I just want to say one thing is that, I'm a person of privilege, and I'm not doing anything out of the ordinary. I'm a history teacher. This could have happened to any number of history teachers. The people in the past who are my heroes, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer. There are a lot of Americans who are not people of privilege and who were enduring tremendous poverty and hardship, and also the ever-present threat of violence. And yet they had the courage to do the same. So, I'm humbled and grateful, but I'm always aware of where I am in this, how I got to this point, the privileges, the benefits that I've had in the course of my lifetime. And I'm well aware of the sacrifices that were made by countless anonymous people that made it possible for me to be in this position right now.
Yep. A lot of people don't recognize when they have privilege. A lot of people, and they don't know what to do with it.
Well, I think part of it, Robin, though, is because I'm a history teacher, and and so there's kind of the irony, right? Is that here we are fighting for teaching of history because we understand what history can do for us.
Yeah.
Pastor, what do you think about all this?
Well, I salute you, Brent. It's good to see your face. When I received the email, I did not put a face, and I was thinking, no joke, Brent was a Black man. So so I'm glad we didn't get that picture. No, I wouldn't have formed an opinion anyways, but it's just good to see your face, Brent. I salute you, and I thank you for standing your grounds, just holding fast to what you believe and keep teaching and teaching the truth. I was sharing with my team here last week when we were talking about bringing you on. I'm from South Carolina. I'm, in the Lexington, West Columbia, the Charleston, that whole zone. That's what I was born and raised in. And my mom as well. So my mom has history there among our white community. My mom is always telling me, Brenda, make sure that you teach your children. Now, I am in my grandchildren are mixed, but my church family is mixed. So we're not into the color thing. However, we are into the history. And my grandchildren are being taught by me and by my husband about the history of where we come from as a race of people. And I remember on one of our shows a couple of weeks ago, it was said that we did not come over on a ship. It's like, okay, there was some people, there was some slaves that was brought over on a ship.
A lot.
And if we drop this out of the history book, if we placate it, if we play around with it, the generation that is already here is not going to pass that information on. So that's one of my salutes to you, Brent. Just keep pushing. And I want to ask you, is this book available to the public? Is this on Amazon? Can we purchase this book outside of the school system? Because I would like to purchase some books for some people.
I appreciate the question. The book is called Creating Black Americans. It's by the preeminent historian Nell Irvin Painter. But what might be helpful, here on this broadcast or any other is, just to start generating a list of books that people have read that have brought them, awareness or comfort or all the above. The other thing I want to say, Brenda, is that it's wonderful to hear that you're from South Carolina, because I just finished teaching my African American history class about the connection between Barbados and how Carolina colony was created in the first place.
Wow.
We all know that it was created based on the cultivation of rice, Barbados sugar, and those two essential cash crops for the growing British Empire. But I also had my students do a Google search and research the Gullah people, because as you know, the Gullah people along the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and northeastern Florida are the living embodiment of
Absolutely
lots of African cultural traditions. And so that was something that was a revelation to my students as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
That's
I just
cool.
checked on Amazon. You can get the book. It is available in hardcover and paperback. I don't know. It doesn't look like you can download it to a Kindle. I was researching this author. I think she also wrote one called Creating White America,
Yes.
which was kind of interesting as well.
I don't want to interrupt, Paul. There's one thing I do want to say to your listeners. And I think that one of the most important strategies that we're using is, if you say that critical race theory is not being taught in any school in the country, the problem with that strategy is that it somehow perpetuates the notion that there's something wrong with critical race theory. What our strategy is very simple. Demand that America's history be taught in its entirety.
Yeah.
Because then you force those people perpetuating the false issue of critical race theory to have to actually defend what parts of our history they don't want taught. And they don't want to go there. And nor do the leaders like DeSantis and others who are fomenting the millions of Americans who have some sense of grievance that somehow their country has been taken from them, right? Hence the phrase "Make America Great Again." So I would be adamant to make sure that people understand that what we need to do is just demand that our history be taught in its entirety.
Absolutely.
Is critical race theory just pertaining to Black history? Because the damage that white people did to Blacks, that was horrific. So
my simple explanation to your viewers, and I would want everybody to understand that in the 1970s, a small group of scholars and professors, only in the legal field, developed a framework. Critical race theory is not history. It was a framework that they developed to try and examine the impact of systemic institutional racism on the legal field, all aspects of it. And over the next several decades, other scholars in other fields, the environment, government, education, they began to apply that framework to study the impact of systemic racism. If you remember, Dr. King was murdered in 1968. A lot of Americans weren't talking about systemic racism because when they talk about racism, it's always defined as some kind of individual act. And even though using the N-word is offensive and disrespectful, That's not systemic racism. So there's nothing controversial about
That's good.
critical race theory. There's nothing controversial about it. In fact, I have a master's degree in African American history, and I only first heard the term in late 2020. So critical race theory, nothing offensive. It's just that if you fight people by just simply denying that it's being taught, you almost legitimize that there's something wrong with it.
Yep.
So this is a distraction.
But
Yes.
also,
Yes.
also, I'm the type of person, if somebody tells me I can't read a book, that's the first book I want to go read.
Yeah.
So let's all educate ourselves on critical race theory. Obviously, there's something that they don't want you to know. Let's all read these books that are being banned. And I heard in the news yesterday that now some parents are trying to ban certain books from the library, including Toni Morrison's Beloved, which,
Wow.
without question is a classic American piece of literature, and it should never be banned from any library. So more is on the way. If you want to talk to us, give us a call, 813-251-9867. I think kind of a takeaway here is these parents who are doing this are showing that a small group of people can try to make a change. It's not a good change in our opinion, but the converse is true. We all can get together and stand up and say, no, we do want these things taught in our schools. And I believe parents should have, some say in the curriculum, but you can't let the loudest ignorant person dictate, what gets taught. There has to be some professional component that, no, you don't get to decide what books we teach. We're going to teach actual history. We're going to teach real history.
And I think hiding behind those words, discomfort, anguish, or guilt, and to really, frankly, to use children as cover when it's you yourself as an adult. No offense, as a grown ass person, you're the one who's perhaps concerned about your own discomfort, anguish, or guilt, and that's what's so sinister, is using children to claim that that's the reason why we shouldn't teach about our nation's history.
I think that the kids went home because they, all kids hang out together. Yeah. And I think there were so many white kids marching during 2020. I think they went home and they started asking questions because they started connecting the dots. And they're saying, is our land, were we like that? Did we own slaves? Did we do all of those things that they're saying we did? And the questions got too tough for those parents. They didn't like it. The kids continue to hang out and do whatever with the other folks, the black kids. And I think this is how it made them very uncomfortable, because now their kids are looking at them differently, saying, we have privilege, because the white kids know what white privilege is, right? We have privilege. We should be doing, da-da-da-da. And I think they didn't have the answers to it.
And to echo that, Robin, the book I would recommend all Americans read is James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, because what James Baldwin talks about, he calls it the lie. What he's talking about is that our country is built on a series of lies, a mythology of what today a lot of people like to call American exceptionalism. And that it become really uncomfortable when you recognize that the nation that you live in, that espouses foundational ideas like liberty, equality, justice, and so on, was inherently, undermining that at every turn by owning human beings.
What was the name of that book again?
That book is James Baldwin, 1963, The Fire Next Time, because what Baldwin was essentially saying is that until we can actually have a reckoning, an honest reckoning that involves discussion and discourse, and the number one rule of teaching anybody anything is that you have to safely make them aware of what you don't know. And that's what we try to do in our classrooms every day. But if we could also start that process with adults and create forums where we could come together and talk openly and honestly without people having a fear of, revealing their ignorance or maybe their own internal bigotry. So we have to start conversations like the one we're having right here.
Yeah. And if if our listeners are interested in the 1619 project, it is available as a podcast. An outstanding podcast. I recommend it to anyone. It's available on iTunes and other podcast providers. It's just a reframing, of history to bring in the actual history of the experience of people who were enslaved and brought to this country, and their contribution to our society,
A lot of contribution.
and how this country would
Yes.
not be what it is without their contribution.
Yes.
I can't see
Absolutely.
why anyone would not want to learn about that.
And I'm glad you brought up the 1619 project, because last year, the governor and the Department of Education, they revised the state curriculum standards. It wasn't a law. They just revised how the teaching of American history should be taught. And they explicitly banned critical race theory. They banned the 1619 project. But what was so insidious is that there's a line in there that says that the teaching of our country should only be based on, and this is almost a quote, the principles, the universal principles found in the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
And what's so fundamentally wrong with that is I'm about to teach the American Revolution next week in my African American history class. Of course, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the document, owned human beings, never freed slaves upon his death. And of course, many of our founding fathers owned slaves. And of course, even African Americans fighting on both sides of the Revolutionary War. And of course, the creation of the Constitution, slave owners threatened to leave the United States, which was only 10 years old at the time, if slavery were in any way jeopardized. So we compromised on slavery. So I would ask my governor, how do I teach about all those undeniable facts?
Right.
Because what you want me to do is to teach that somehow our country was founded on these principles, and then we rest and just accept that that's what history is.
Yeah, we do need to know those things. And I would have thought that we were well beyond a point of time in our history that we'd even be talking about this.
Well, I think also that even before this conversation occurred in schools, there's always a fight to teach real history. Only in February is not enough, right, to celebrate Black History Month. But there should, in Hillsborough County, they've been fighting, they've passed, I think, an ordinance or a policy that they're going to teach Black history or make it more an elective or something. And they're yet to do it because now they push it back on funding.
Mm-hmm.
They have always minimized and taught just the small bad that we were slaves, and that's it. And never expound on anything else. So when we're in school, unless we're teaching our kids at home, hey, we are doctors, lawyers, and all of those other things, and we were great inventors. We had a great contribution to this country. We're just hearing about the week of slavery.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Robin, because there's the history, and then there's the history behind the teaching of the history, and it's only been in the last 30 years that even African American history as a course was taught. So even the fight to get many aspects of our history put in the curriculum standard, just in the last 5 years, we've added in Florida, the Rosewood Massacre, the Ocoee Massacre. We've added redlining. So we've seen progress in terms of the things that students are actually expected to learn about. At the same time, now we're having to fight against people who are saying that all of that stuff is just called critical race theory.
Right.
What's the significance of the year 1619?
1619 was the year that the first human beings from West Africa arrived in the British colony of Jamestown. Now, by that time, the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire had already begun to use human beings from West Africa as enslaved people. But when the first Africans, and I always point out to my students learn that the people in West Africa were not Africans. They were not Black. They were diverse groups of human beings that were all defined that way. And that gets to the whole creation of the idea of race, which is a whole nother story. But 1619 is the year that the first people from West Africa, the first 20, arrived in the colony of Jamestown. Of course, Jamestown becomes Virginia, and then those colonies become the basis for America.
And then how many enslaved people were brought over during the whole time period where it was legal and to do?
If you basically look at all of the empires that use what's called the Middle Passage, which is what we call the transport of human beings across the Atlantic that lasted for well over 300 years, sadly we'll never know, but scholars estimate at least 12.5 million human beings were brought across the Atlantic Ocean to different parts of the Americas.
And just to look at those pictures, the pictures of how they were like starting just housed, not fit in the it's amazing to me. It is just amazing to me. Sadly, it's amazing to me.
Do you know how many were brought to the United States?
You know, what's really interesting is what's striking to my students is when they realize that of the Americas collectively, the smallest percentage were brought to the United States. And that's something to sit with for a second, because consider the long history, consider the terror and the pain and the dehumanization that's undeniable that happened in our country. But if you go down to Brazil, for example, if you go to the Caribbean, you know, there were far more people from West Africa brought to those parts of the Americas. So that just magnifies the intensity and the depth of the suffering. Because
that's something that I was doing some research last night, and there's a website, I can't remember what it's called, where it sort of tracks the ships that came over. And
just type in, sorry to interrupt, Paul, but if you just go to Google and go to YouTube and you type in slave trade time lapse, it's quite humbling. I show my students, and it's a time lapse, and on the map, every dot that goes across the Atlantic is a documented slave ship. Now that's a documented. And what happens is you're seeing these dots magnify, and my students are just stunned at when you get to a certain time, like 1750, and there's hundreds of dots on the screen at any time.
Yes.
Brent, may I ask a question really quick?
Yes.
Brent, your class, what's the makeup of your class? Are they all African Americans, or there's a mixture?
That's such a great question, Brenda. You know, I am always fond of saying that public education is the foundation of our democracy. And one of the reasons I love my country is because we take everybody, right? We take everybody. And everybody's in my class, right? I've got students. I've got a kid from Myanmar who doesn't know any of this. He's just come from Myanmar. I've got kids from all over the world. I've got kids from all over the United States. So, you know, you often hear people talk about, you know, well, should African Americans take African American history? And I say, well, should all American students take American history? Anybody should take African American history, period.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. When I looked at that timeline of the ships crossing, I was struck by how many did go to South America. And I think, at least when I was in school, we weren't taught much American history, but we weren't taught any history of South America. And it just had never occurred to me how many enslaved people were brought there. And that I didn't know until last night that it was far more than were brought to the United States.
And I would say, Paul, the other thing that comes with that, though, and here's something that a lot of us just never talk about. How did race get created? You see, this is one of the most powerful things that my African American history students learn. And it's really quite shocking and jolting and mind-blowing, because race is an artificial social construct. All human beings are 99.98% genetically identical. And the 0.002% represents things like hair color and eye color and skin color. And I often ask my students, I do an exercise with them, and it's quite powerful. I say, you know, imagine if we lined everybody up on a wall and you arranged each other in terms of your skin tone, lightest to darkest. And I would encourage you guys to have this conversation with people as well, because it's a great entryway to talk about race. And you line them up on a wall, lightest to darkest. Now you got a problem, because where does white end and where does black begin? Race doesn't exist biologically, but there were people who had power, both in the Spanish colonies and in the Portuguese colonies and then the British colonies. There were people who had the power to define an entire group of people as being A, slave, B, inferior, C, black. And of course, those diverse ethnic groups from West Africa were not all the same, but then they're defined the same. So in the idea of creating race, that's foundational, and all Americans should know that. And then what's even more liberating is to find out that out of all those diverse groups of human beings, this is one of the most refreshing, liberating parts of our history. A unique culture develops over time that we call African American. That African American, the idea of being African American, came out of many different diverse groups of people who had to both survive in the face of defined brutality called slavery and then later Jim Crow, but then created something so unique that many other Americans have worked to emulate that in the forms of, quote, black art, the blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip hop. I mean, think about what that's given to America. And then I always ask my students, like, is rap music black music, or is it American music? So you really get into an understanding once you see the contributions, but you have to always start with what race is.
I got to cut you off there because our time is up. Loved having you on the show. Please come back.
Yes,
You have a
great
lot to
having
teach
you,
us.
Brent.
And we'll catch you next week on the Call for Help.